Hello, this is David from DN Cognitive Counseling. Tonight we have a lot to go over, and let's just get to it. This is continuing in the book White Fragility, page 28, where she starts out with white supremacy. When we look back to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, we may think of the white supremacists as the people who saw in photos and on television beating blacks at lunch counters, bombing black churches, and screaming at Little Ruby Bridges, the first African-American child to integrate at an all-white elementary school in Louisiana in 1960. Today we might think of this self-described alt-right, white nationalists marching with torches in Virginia and shouting blood and soil as they protest the removal of Confederate war memorials. Most white people do not identify with these images of white supremacists, and so take for great umbrage to the term being used more broadly. I wonder why that is. And again, I would wonder if she took umbrage to the fact that I take people who utilize racial ideology the way she does as Nazis, the same way that Adolf Hitler did. And I would take umbrage to the fact that I redefined her book the same as Mein Kampf. But not in the same way, it's just in its broader sense. For sociologists and those involved in the current racial justice movements, however, white supremacy is a descriptive and useful term to capture all-encompassing centrality and assumed superiority of people defined and perceived as white, and the practices based on this assumption. Absolutely untrue. This is not a good way of trying to redefine a term with a term that's already been focused to such a negative degree. The fact that white people do not want to be associated with being racist is healthy. For people coming out and talking about their racism and saying they're white and racist, with the belief, understanding that this system believes that white people can't ever get out of being racist, then all you're doing, in a sense, is stating that you're going to continue to be racist. And even when you quote-unquote say you're an anti-racist, you're going to end up being racist anyway. And I will illustrate that as well. White supremacy in this context does not refer to the individual white people and their individual intentions or actions, but to an overarching political, economic, and social system of domination. Again, racism is a structure, not an event. While hate groups that openly proclaim white supremacy do exist, and this term refers to them also, the popular consciousness solely associated white supremacy with these racial groups. This reductive definition obscures the reality of the larger system at work and prevents us from addressing their system. There's a great movie docu-movie called Waiting for Superman. And in there is an African-American educator who's explaining about how the system, as he called it, the blob of the school system, caused a lot of problems. He basically explains that it's not one individual doing something. It's the way that the system has been interacted and its effect. Blobs exist in a lot of systems. That does not inherently make the system itself racist. And that's the mistake that she's making. It is true that you're going to see disparity based upon the systems. That's true in any system, and we're going to go through that a little bit. But the nature that systems create disparity does not mean that in itself the system is racist. While racism in other cultures exists based on different ideas of which racial group is superior to another, the United States is a global power, and through movies and mass media, corporate culture, advertising, U.S.-owned manufacturing, military presence, historical colonial relations, missionary work, and other means, white supremacy is circulated globally. So, while racism in other cultures exists, by the way, in every culture in the world, on different ideas and racial groups, 100% true, the United States is a global power. Well, why is that? What makes the United States this global power? Why is the United States better than every place else in this world? And when I say better, I'm talking about from an objective standpoint, not subjective. When you take a look at its ability to create wealth, when you take a look at its ability for scientific innovation, when you take a look at its military power, when you take a look at every single objective form, the United States overshadows every other country. Why is that? Well, all the things that she negates in the beginning part of the book is the reason why. We are not revolved around the idea of a race. We're not all Germans. We're not all Frenchmen. We're not all Danish. We're not all Saudi Arabian. We're not all name the country. It doesn't make a difference. We don't have that racial identity. What we have is an identity to ideas. Our ideas are what's unified us. The idea of freedom, the idea of individualism, the idea that you can basically change your social class based upon your work and your work ethic. These are concepts that were universal to all the different colonies that came here from England and France and Denmark and Spain, all the different countries and all different people that came here. The sad part is there was something also called slavery. And those people did not come here willingly. And those people were forced into labor. But the fact that that injustice went on and that horror went on does not mean that the country itself, that every fabric of it is racist. There's racist elements and there's racism, and you have to be able to identify what it is, but to state that everything's about racism is to also negate the fact that the very founders of that same country were fighting against racism from its inception. And if you understand why they negotiated at that point because they had a bigger fish to fry with English, then you understand why these things happened in order for the unification of the country to happen. But the idea was, by the founding fathers, that basically slavery would die by the very nature of what the ideals of the country stood for. And if you read their arguments that took place in Congress, they weren't called Congress at that point, but the people that were creating the Constitution and the arguments that went back and forth, you understand that this actually happened at that point in history. The powerful ideology promoted the idea of whiteness is an ideal for humanity well beyond the West. White supremacy is especially relevant in countries that have a history of colonialism by Western nations. What she's basically saying is that Western nations share the same ideology of the country. That then she calls white supremacy. In this book, The Racial Contract, in his book, Racial Contract, Charles W. Mills argues that racial contract is a tactic and sometimes explicit agreement among members of people of Europe to assert, promote, and maintain the ideal of white supremacy in relation to all other people of the world. This agreement is intentional and an integral characteristic of the social contract, underwriting of all social contracts. By the way, in philosophy, there's arguments of whether there is a social contract or not, but we're not going to go there. White supremacy has shaped a system of global European domination. It brings into existence whites and non-whites, full persons and sub-persons. It influences white moral theory and moral psychology, and it is imposed on non-whites through ideological conditioning and violence. Mills says what has usually been taken as the racist exception has really been the rule. What has been taken as the rule, racial equality, has been really the exception. Mills describes white supremacy as the unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today. He noted that although white supremacy has shaped Western political thought for hundreds of years, it was never named in this way. White supremacy is rendered invisible, while other political systems, socialism, capitalism, fascism, are identified and studied. In fact, much of white supremacy's power is drawn from its invisibility. It's taken for granted, aspects that are underwrite all other political and social contracts. That's a beautiful thought process, and it's a beautiful thought that Mills makes. But can you prove it? It's an assertion without fact. If I say the reason why everything is the way that it is, because as L. Ron Hubbard put it in his book in Dianetics, that basically we are all basically remnants of aliens that are controlling us, and we have no free will, that it's the alien souls that are controlling all of us, and we just think we're in control, but it's really these other souls. It's a beautiful thought, but no proof. And in reality, that's what Mills says here. He makes statements without any proof. Mills makes 2 points that are critical to our understanding of white fragility. First, white supremacy never acknowledged. Second, we cannot study any socio-political system without addressing how that system is mediated by race. The failure to acknowledge white supremacy protects it from examination and holds it in place. Notice the contradiction. She says in the first part how we've identified white supremacy as this idea of attacking black people and the holding them back, the Jim Crow laws of the 1960s. That was identified. The United States fought against it. And again, not everybody, obviously. There were people that were pro and were racist who actually wanted to keep those laws to people that made those laws. And by the way, maybe she should look at those people who did and understand a little bit about their political philosophy. But the nature of the people that made those laws and the fact that they did make those laws were white supremacy. And it was intended to be so. That does not mean we're in the same exact position today and that those aspects of the laws are the same as they are today. In Ta-Nehisi Coates' essay, and she quotes him again, The Case for Reparation, he makes a similar point. I love how she quotes people that quote each other continually. To ignore the fact that one of the oldest republics in the world was erected on a foundation of white supremacy, to pretend that the problem of dual society are the same as the problem of unregulated capitalism, is to cover the sin of national plunder with the sin of national lying. The lie ignores the fact that reducing American poverty to ending white supremacy are not the same. White supremacy is not merely the work of hot-headed demagogues or a matter of false consciousness, but a force so fundamental to America that it's difficult to imagine the country without it. In light of the reality of historical and continual white supremacy, white complaints about reverse racism by programs intended to ameliorate the most basic levels of discrimination are profoundly petty and delusional, as Mills summarizes. Both globally and within particular nation states, then white people, Europeans, and their descendants continue to benefit from the racial contract, which creates a world in their cultural image. Political states differentially favoring their interest on an economic structured around the racial exploitation of others and of moral psychology, skewed consciously or unconsciously toward privilege, taking the status quo of differing racial entitlements of normative legitimate and not to be investigated further. Race scholars, I'd love to know how in the world you become a race scholar, use the term white supremacy to describe a socio-political economic system of domination based on racial categories that benefit those defined as perceived as whites. The system of structural power privilege centralizes and alleviates white people as a group. If, for example, we look at racial breakdown of the people who control our institutions, we see telling numbers in 2016, 2017. Now, before I get to the numbers that she goes through, there's a couple things that are very important here. One is they talk about the idea that people who complain about affirmative action, that by saying that it becomes like a reverse racism, that they're saying, well, this is just trying to correct something. And we're going to take a look at that because affirmative action is not a de facto, oh, this is a great program and this is great for everybody. But we'll talk about it from the other side. I'm not going to give an opinion about whether yes or no. I just want to say there is another side of the opinion that, again, she just seems to totally disregard. Also, when she talks about the idea of race scholars, she's not talking about a science like some people that are sitting down and actually studying this and being able to take control groups and being able to figure things out. She's talking about people that have philosophical ideas, find things that they like to believe themselves, and then bring proof to it and say this is the truth that we believe. And in actuality, she actually does this earlier on when she gets the idea that she doesn't believe in the scientific method and everything is about the way that you see things subjectively anyway. So if you believe in this stuff subjectively, then it becomes true subjectively. She goes through the 10 richest Americans, 100% white, 7 of whom are among the 10 richest in the world. U.S. Congress, 90% white. Governors, 96% white. Top military advisor, 100% white. President and vice president, now 100% white. Was not 4 years ago, but we're not going to go there. U.S. House Freedom Caucus, 99% white. U.S. Presidential Cabinet, 91% white. People decide which TV shows we see, 93% white. People decide books we read, 90% white. I didn't realize there are people who decided I'd read this book. Whoever decided that, I'd like to be able to punish them. But I didn't realize that they decide what books I read. People who decide which news is covered, 85% white. People who decide which music produced, 95% white. People who direct 100 top-grossing films of the time worldwide, 95% white. Teachers, 82% white. Full-time college professors, 84% white. Owners of men's professional football teams, 97% white. These numbers are not describing minor organizations, nor are the institution's special interest groups. The groups listed above are the most powerful in the country. The numbers are not a matter of good people versus bad people. They represent people of power and control by a racial group, and that has the position to disseminate and protect its own self-image worldwide and its interests across the entire society. Also, if you went through that, the majority of those people are men. So by that, it's white men who are the ones. And of that, what percentage of those are a percentage of the white male population? Now, I want you to think about this again. If every single individual male, white, was a police officer, and the entire police force was white, would that mean that I have the power of the police force because of my color of my skin? Or does it mean that there are just more white people on the police force? The nature that there are more white people in these places does not necessitate that it filters down to everybody that's white. You don't say, well, most of the rich people are white, therefore all white people are rich. It doesn't work that way. You can have also the poorest of people being white, but if you only look at the top and say, well, they're white, and then you don't look at anybody else, it's a fallacy. You're doing it based upon the top and saying, look at the top, look at what they have here, and go, look, disparity. One of the most potent ways white supremacy is disseminated is through the media representation, which has profound impact on how we see the world. Those who write and direct films of our cultural narratives, the stories that tell shape our worldview. Given the majority of white people live in racial isolation from people of color and black people in particular, and have very few authentic cross-racial relationships, white people are deeply influenced by the racial messages in films. Now, this is something I do agree with, that when you don't have a connection to people of the outside, when you only are insulated, you're going to have a very skewed version of people. Consider one statistic from the preceding list. Well, of the 100 top grossing films worldwide in 2016, 95% were directed by white Americans. That is an incredibly homogeneous group of directors, because these men are not most likely at the top of social hierarchy in terms of race, class, and gender. And they're least likely to have a wide variety of authentic, egalitarian, cross-racial relationships. Now, that I don't know if it's true or not. How do I know who these directors, who their relationships are, and who their friends are, who they're married to? This is just assumed again. And it could be, maybe they are. But that still would not mean anything. Why is it that in China, in India, in Pakistan, in Saudi Arabia, that they still choose movies that are produced by the United States and not produced by China? And by the way, China's produced a lot of movies as well. It just does not get as worldwide acclaim, and people don't run to see them. Wonder why that is. Because maybe that these directors are giving people what they want to see, and therefore then they become popular. It's sort of like books. Certain books become popular, and the nature of the book becomes popular, even when they're wrong. Yet they are in positions to represent the racial other. Their representation of the other are thereby extremely narrow and problematic, and yet they are reinforced over and over. Further, these biased representations have been disseminated worldwide. While white supremacy originated in the West, it circulates globally. The nature of that these directors who tell stories and narratives very well could be creating these stereotypes and racial barriers. Could be. That doesn't create, again, white supremacy. It's the idea of the way that the nature of movie system works. Nobody set the movie system up. It's a system based upon money. The reason why they're going to be probably redoing Star Wars is because it was a big bomb, a big flop, and it destroyed their franchise. Why? They were pushing a political agenda instead of telling a good story. If they told a good story, it would have been very, very popular. People would have bought the toys. It would have been started Star Wars all over again. But that's not what happened. What happened was they told a bad story, and instead of taking responsibility for the bad story, they decided to blame misogyny. That was the reason why. People couldn't take a strong woman, unlike Princess Leia in the original, who was a strong woman, that nobody had a problem with. So the entire narrative becomes something that people are like saying, this doesn't make any sense. But you start blaming people based upon your poor story, and then blame them why they didn't like it. But this is what happens when you don't believe in objectivity. when you believe everything is subjective. See, if you take a look at the idea that good things will objectively do well over the long term, and bad things will eventually die out when they get exposed, that you'll find that it will continue. White resistance to the term white supremacy prevents us from examining how these messages shape us. Or it's got nothing to do with white supremacy, but has other reasons that you're not exploring, because you give it only one answer without any sort of complexity. Explicit white supremacists understand this. Christian Picanali, a former white nationalist, explained that the white nationalists recognizing that they had to distance themselves from the terms racist and white supremacy to gain broader appeal. It's interesting the white supremacist was smart enough to figure out that the rest of the country think that white supremacists, they have a term they have to get away from. But you weren't smart enough to figure out that calling every person white a white supremacist was going to be a problem. The white supremacist group understood this. You didn't. Okay? So they said, wait a minute, people here do not like white supremacy. They don't like racism. Ours is not going to work anymore. White people aren't going to go, great, a white supremacist group, let me join. So they needed to rebrand themselves. Too bad you didn't realize that when you wrote this book, instead of just calling everybody names. He describes the alt-right and the white national movement as the culmination of a 30-year effort to massage the white supremacist message. We recognized back then we were turning away the average American white racist, and that we needed to look and speak more like our neighbors. The idea that we had to blend in, normalize, make the message more palatable. Derek Ballack, godson of David Duke and former key youth in the white nationalist movement, explains, my whole talk was the fact that you could run as a Republican and say things like we need to shut down immigration, we need to fight affirmative action, we need to end globalism, and you can win these positions, maybe as long as you don't get outed as a white nationalist and get all the controversy that comes along with it. Now, does that mean those things are white nationalist and white supremacist? So I want to hit a couple of points here very quickly. So the first thing, again, was that whole long list we saw of all the numbers and saying, look at these things and look at these problems and look at the differences in these situations. So let's take a look at this article here. Minorities better represented in the Indian parliament than the US. Minorities tend to be underrepresented in most major democracies of the world. Why? Because all the democracies of the world have white supremacists? And by the way, in non-democracies, minorities are represented even less. So democracies represent them more, but still they're underrepresented. The recently concluded elections have shown the spotlight on the underrepresentation of Muslims in the Lok Sabha, but India does not seem to fare too badly compared to other democracies of the world where it comes to minority representation. A Mint analysis of 6 democracies, India, US, UK, Germany, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, shows that minorities tend to be underrepresented in these democracies, and by the way, all of the rest also. As the accompanying chart shows, the analysis was based on the representation scores for each minority group in each democracy, computed as the difference between the share of a minority group in the legislature and the share of a minority group in the total population. When it comes to the representation of larger demographic minority, India fares better than the US representation score. The largest demographic minority in India, the Muslim, composed 13.4% of the population according to 2001 census, but they make up only 4.2% of the Lok Sabha. That's a representation score of minus 9.16 percentage points. Hispanic in the US in comparison have a representation score of minus 10%. Wow, a whole 0.96 percent points. African Americans don't fare too better, despite the U.S. having a president of the ethnic group, but represents a score of minus 5 percentage points. So African Americans are actually overrepresented comparatively to Hispanics. That said, while the U.S. isn't representative of its ethnic minorities, it has an impressive record when it comes to its religious minorities. The largest religious minority in the U.S., the Catholics, represent 22% of the adult population, and it's overrepresented in Congress by almost 9 percentage points. The Jewish community, which makes up only 2% of the adult population, goes 6.2% of U.S. Congress. So I'm not going to go through the rest of this, but the point was to show that all these groups in every country, minorities, do not do better than the population of the general population, that the general population is overrepresented. And then you see there are certain groups that overrepresent. So what ends up happening when you get a book like this, those groups become targeted as evil. Oh, they're overrepresented, something's wrong. No, there's nothing wrong with a group overrepresenting in an area. It means that the group is working or doing something. Now the question is, you want to take a look at what? That's social psychology. You understand what's going on, and then you could see why they're being successful. But the nature of just saying, well, it's just racism that does that, makes absolutely no sense. And by the way, white supremacists do not consider Jews white, as you saw in the videos that I showed you in the past, yet they still make up an overrepresentation in government. So if the system was a white supremacist ideology, then that would not be the case. And by the way, African Americans do better than Hispanics. The question is why? So again, it would be a question about why is that happening. But again, she says about the idea of these issues, about today's white nationalists are not the first to recognize the importance of distancing oneself from more explicit expressions of white supremacy. Unlike DiAngelo, who calls whites white supremacists, in 1981 interview, Lee Atwater, Republican political strategist and advisor to President Ronald Reagan and George H. Bush, explains what came to be known as the Southern Strategy, how to appeal to the racism of the white Southern voters without pronouncing it openly. You start out in 1954 by saying, and then she uses the N-word 3 times. By 1968, you can't say the N-word. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. You're getting so abstract now that you're talking about cutting taxes and all these things. You're talking about total economic things and a byproduct of them, in that blacks get hurt worse than whites, and subconsciously maybe that is part of it. But I'm saying that if it's getting the abstract, then the code, then we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut this is much more abstract than ever the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than the N-word. Our umbrage at the term white supremacy only serves to protect the process it describes and obscures the mechanism of racial inequality. No, our umbrage of white supremacy is the idea that we don't want that type of ideology, and we rejected it as a majority of people, because there are still people that believe in it today. Still, I understand to be very charged for many white people, especially older white people, who associate the term with extreme hate groups. And it's interesting that the hate groups understood to get away from this term, and Robin DiAngelo didn't. However, I hope to have made clear that white supremacy is something much more pervasive and subtle than the actions explicit with white nationalists. No, she didn't. And in fact, it's actually something that she's saying is worse, that you're complicit in the system because you benefit from it. White supremacy describes the culture we live in a culture that positions white people and all the associated with them as ideal. White supremacy is more than an idea that whiteness is superior to people of color. It is the deeper premise that supports the idea, the definition of whites as the norm, or the standard for human, and people of color as a deviation of that norm. Naming white supremacy changes the conversation in 2 key ways. It makes the system visible and shifts the locus of change onto white people where it belongs. It also points us in the direction of lifelong work that is uniquely ours, changing our complicity with and the investment in racism. This does not mean that people of color do not play a part, but the full weight of responsibility rests those who control the institutions. I love how she puts in that the aspect of African Americans play a part in this as well. So I want to address now the 3 things that she mentioned about this white supremacy ideology, because it promotes based upon this. So the first one I want to look at is Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell talks about affirmative action. And you tell me if his ideology is based upon white supremacy.
Education in the United States. You talked about affirmative action, and you came up with some statistics, and I wanted to ask you about it. Well, I look for, here it is. You said that at the University of California, Berkeley, for example, where the entering freshman class has been described as, quote, wonderfully diverse, unquote, because the, quote, class closely reflects the actual ethnic distribution of California high school students. These are your words. More than 70% of black students fail to graduate.
Yes.
Why?
Because they're mismatched with Berkeley. That is, these students, the average black student in Berkeley is above the national average on test scores, It's just that the average white student is further above the national average, and the average Asian student further above than the white students. And so in that atmosphere, these students who have every qualification to succeed are artificially turned into failures. And the only beneficiary of that is the University of California at Berkeley. Because what they've effectively done is rented these bodies for window dressing for a few years. And then when they're through with them, they're put aside. A new bunch of bodies are brought in.
Have you told them that?
Oh, yes.
And what do they say?
Oh, different things. I remember one fellow saying, "Oh, Tom, I'm just a little guy. I can't do anything about this." Which, wonderful. But the people who really have the influence are not the people I've talked with. Those people know exactly what they're doing. There's another group, I guess, that's benefits from this. You have an establishment there, a Black Studies establishment, who needs students to be in their classrooms, and these students serve those purposes. People who have political movements have people they can mobilize for those movements while those students are there. It's very much like what happens in athletics, that you have students who come in, as long as they can score touchdowns, the coach is happy. The fact that these students don't graduate is not the coach's problem. His problem is how to hold on to his six-figure salary and his job. And the students have to be sacrificed, and they are sacrificed.
Let's take it first from the student standpoint. Of the 312 black students entering Berkeley in 1987, all were admitted under affirmative action. You say that 70% of those failed to graduate. What would you tell those students to do under the circumstances, knowing that statistic?
I would tell them what I've told students in general of all races to do, which is to go to schools that match your educational capabilities at the time. Because you need to be matched with a school. You shouldn't try to go to where the glitzy name is or what have you. Now, unfortunately, many of the minority students have such low income that they must go to wherever the money is. And the money is disproportionately at the kinds of schools that they will find very, very difficult to graduate from.
All right, let's take it from the standpoint of the school. You're at the school and you want to do good. You say it doesn't work. What would you tell the school to do?
To admit students on the basis of their qualifications.
But what happens if they come up and statistically they have nothing close to the population?
Well, they won't have anything at the top level. But we have more than 3,000 colleges and universities in this country. Every human being that's not severely mentally retarded is perfectly qualified to be at one of those institutions.
There's a very important point that Thomas Sowell is bringing up in terms of the idea of affirmative action. And he's not a white supremacist. And he's talking about an actual law of unintended consequences, is that by admitting students who are not ready for that type of school, they're putting them at a disadvantage, and then you have a 70% dropout rate, which is part of the problem. And instead of getting them ready for that school, it's sort of like, well, tough. Had they gone to schools that were better suited for them, they would have done better, and you would get a lot of degrees and better degrees because of it. But he's not the only one to talk about this. And I wanted to talk about a discussion with Larry Elders and Walter Williams.
Good afternoon. Your column, College Destruction of Black Students, is up on my website, larryelder.com. Why did you write it, Walter?
Well, this a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. She came under a lot of the flack, and she just kind of casually suggested some of the effects of affirmative action. And she's a teacher in the law school, and she pointed out that she's never seen any black students who are in the top 10% or even only a few in the top half of their class. And she was being attacked as a racist by the university, and she was deprived of her class. So that kind of got it started. But I think that one of the problems that black Americans need to face is that schools like the University of Pennsylvania, it's seventh rank in terms of law schools in the country, and what they do, they recruit black students to the school, so that white liberals feel better about themselves. And these students have a lot of difficulty that they would not have if they were recruited to some other school, more in pace with their learning.
And the other point you make out is that the K through 12 education that most blacks get, you say is, quote, grossly fraudulent, close quote.
Oh, yeah. And, and I find it remarkable that black parents are not doing anything about it if they know about it. For example, nationally, only 17% of black kids who graduate from high schools are proficient in reading, and something like 7% are proficient in math. And there are a lot of high schools in the country, predominantly black high schools, where not a single student in the entire school tests proficient. And one case I talked about some time ago was the city of Baltimore, Maryland, and there are 39 high schools in the city, and in 13 of these schools, not a single student tested proficient in math. And the thing about it is that you see that these kids are graduating, they come down in the cap and gown, and they're admitted to colleges, and their parents feel so proud about them, but they've received a fraudulent education, and the kids are receiving a fraudulent education in cities that are run by blacks. I mean, in Baltimore, and Philadelphia, and Chicago, and Detroit, these are, blacks have tremendous political power, but they sit in just idleness and watch the academic credibility of black kids being destroyed.
My guest is Professor Walter Williams. He teaches at George Mason University School of Law. Professor, in your autobiography and in the autobiography of one of your friends, Thomas Sowell, you both talk about the fact that this wasn't always the case. Tom Sowell grew up in New York, and he said these were schools that were segregated, but the Irish school and the Italian school and the black school, generally they competed pretty much equally in academic tests.
Oh, that's absolutely right. And Thomas Sowell writes, I think it's called Myths and Tragedies of Black Education. He points out that Paul Laurence Dunbar in 1900 and between 1890 and 1900, its black students, and there were no white students at Paul Laurence Dunbar, they received really shoddy financial support from the city. Its black students outscored white students in the whole Washington metropolitan area. So I think that we're blaming too much on external factors. Well, number one, for kids to get a good education, for any kid to get a good education, whether he's white, black, or purple, somebody must make sure he goes to bed on time. Somebody must make sure he does his homework. Somebody must get him up in the morning and feed him breakfast, and somebody must make him a mind to teachers. Now, if that's not done, I don't care how much money you put in education, you're not going to get education.
So Walter Williams is talking there with Elders, Larry Elders. And again, I don't believe that either one of them is a white supremacist. They have an idea about why affirmative action is problematic and what is caused. They bring up stats and figures about why that's the case. They talk about the issue. Now, those are two people that knew each other. There's another person that was talking about the idea of immigration. And we said, oh, wow, if you're against immigration, you must be a white supremacist also. Well, here is somebody else who's going to talk about immigration.
Well, Project 21 is an organization whose membership is primarily black Americans who want to make sure that the conversation on public policy issues facing all of America includes the real broad perspectives that exist in the black American community. All too often in the mainstream media, people like Jesse Jackson, and I call him Al Not So Sharpton, get to pretend that they speak for the breadth and depth of all of the views that black Americans have. We at Project 21 recognize the importance of faith. We believe in the importance of family. We like the idea of personal responsibility, limited government, free markets, and we believe that that mindset and those experiences ought to be part of the conversation. So we're always eager to look at the very big public policy issues and even some of the small issues and make sure that we weigh in with the perspective that reflects the real breadth of view that exists in black America as well as in all of America.
That's right. Those issues affect all of America, as you say. They may affect different demographics differently, but those issues resonate and touch all Americans. I wish the Republican Party would get that message out there instead of trying to respond to a different type of racism, as I call it, trying to have a black message, an Hispanic message, this message, that message. All right, switching gears now. You talk about those public policies which affect Americans. One which President Obama appears to be preparing to do is changing the number of upping the number of people that get designated as a refugee status. What is very fascinating about this, about him doing so, if he does, is that he would be violating his own policy, which he set not so long ago. Tell us about that, Horace Cooper.
Well, sure. A couple years ago, the president had an executive order and a finding made on how his administration was going to handle the refugee issue, and that is dealing with people who come from countries who are being persecuted, and if they return to those countries, they risk serious harm. Now, that number of individuals has been between 75, 85,000. He set that number at 70,000, and he designated various regions of the world to be the places where that number of 70,000 could be filled. We're now hearing that he plans to look at the Latin America immigration problem, a crisis that his administration has largely created, and attempt to redefine the definition of refugee so that it covers those individuals by claiming that if where you live there is a threat that people who will break the law may harm or injure you, you could meet the requirements for refugee status. Here's some problems with that. One is this isn't going to allow for people like the Kurds in Iraq to be able to say, well, wait, ISIS is out of control. We get to come to America. This isn't going to allow the people in Nigeria who are clearly being persecuted by Boko Haram and other terrorist groups, and you can look all across the world. But instead, it's going to attempt to redefine, we believe unlawfully, redefine the definition of persecution to say, if drive-by shootings are happening, if high levels of drug activity are happening, or other kinds of criminal mayhem, and you don't like it, you get to come to America. It doesn't seem to me to be a strong argument that ultimately will bear out, and this is the kind of thing that will lead to litigation, but it's not the role of the president to even take on this kind of approach.
Now again, whether you agree, disagree is not the issue. The issue is that here you have a situation where an African-American man is telling you his political point of view. He's not a white supremacist, not a racist, but would mirror the idea of a problem with an immigration policy. And that's the part, that's what's important, is that this book doesn't do any of that. There's no nuance. It's the idea of putting things together, calling things a narrative that is just inappropriate. The white racial frame. Sociologist Joe Fagan coined the term white racial frame to describe how whites circulate and reinforce racial messages that position whites as superior. In this way, the white racial frame rests on as a key mechanism of white supremacy. The frame is deep and extensive with thousands of stored bits. These bits are pieces of cultural information, images, stories, interpretations, omissions, silences that are pressed along from one person to group to the next, from one generation to the next. The bits circulate both explicitly and implicitly, for example, through movies, television, news, and other media, stories told by family and friends, by constantly using the right racial frame to interpret social relations and integrating new bits. Whites reinscribe the frame even deeper. At the most general level, the racial frame views whites as superior in culture and achievements and views people of color as generally as less social, economic, and political consequences. People of color are seen as inferior to whites in making and keeping of a nation. At the next level of framing, because social institutions, education, medicine, law, government, finance, and military are controlled by whites, white dominance is unremarkable and taken for granted. That whites are disproportionately enriched and privileged via the institutions is also taken for granted. We are entitled to more privilege and resources because we are better people. At the deepest level of white frame, negative stereotypes and images of racial others as inferior are reinforced and accepted. At this level, corresponding emotions such as fear, contempt, and resentments are also stored. The frame includes both negative understanding of people of color and positive understanding of whites and the white institutions, is so internalized, so submerged, that it is never consciously considered or challenged by most whites. To get a sense of the white racial frame below the surface of your conscious awareness, think back to your earliest time when you were aware that people from racial groups other than yours existed. People of color recall a sense of always having been aware, while most white people recall being aware by at least age 5. And this would actually depend. If you are a white boy growing up in an African American neighborhood, you are very much aware of your skin color at a very young age. If you lived in a primarily white environment and having trouble remembering, think about Disney movies, music videos, sports heroes, Chinese food, Aunt Jemima syrup, Uncle Ben's rice, the Taco Bell Chihuahua, Columbus Day, Apu from The Simpsons, and the donkey from Shrek. Reflect on the representations and ask yourself, did the parents tell you the race that didn't matter and everyone was equal? Did they have many friends of color? If people of color did not live in your neighborhood, why didn't they? Where did they live? What images, sounds, and smells do you associate with the other neighborhoods? What kind of activities did you think of when you went there? Were you encouraged to visit the neighborhoods, or were you discouraged from visiting these neighborhoods? What about schools? What made a school good? What went to good schools? Who went to bad schools? If the school in your area was racially segregated, as most schools in the United States are, why didn't you attend the school together? If this is because you lived in different neighborhoods, why did you live in different neighborhoods? Were their schools considered equal to you? Better than you? Worse than yours? If this was busing in your town, in which direction did you go? Who was bused into whose school? Why did the busing go in one direction and not the other? If you went to school together, did you all sit together in the cafeteria? If not, why? Were the honors of advanced placement classes and lower track equally or racially integrated? If not, why not? Now think about your teachers. Who was your first time you had a teacher of the same race as yours? Did you often have teachers of the same race of your own? Many white people reflecting on these questions realize that they almost always had white teachers. Many didn't have a teacher of color until college. Conversely, many people of color have rarely, if ever, had a teacher who reflected their own race. Why is that important to reflect our teachers in an effort to uncover our racial socializations and the message we receive from schools? As you answer these questions, also consider which race were geographically closer to you than others. If your school was perceived as racially diverse, which races were more represented? How did the racial distribution affect the sense of values associated with the school? For example, if white and Asian heritage students were the primary racial group in your school is likely to be seen as a better than school with more representations than from black and Latino students. Why were you learning about racial hierarchy and at your place in it from geography? Now again, this is a bad argument about the nature of neighborhoods and groups. If you've ever been a person that was walking through a neighborhood and you wanted to see the neighborhood, and you are of a different color than the neighborhood, many times you're going to get a very bad experience. The people are going to look at you differently. They're going to treat you differently. You may get attacked. You may get verbally attacked. May get physically attacked, depending where you go and why you go there. One of the things I had to do when I was doing EI, which is early intervention, working with 0 to 3-year-olds, was I would go into people's homes to visit them and their children. And many times when I would go in, the mothers would tell me, don't come after this time because it gets dark and where it comes becomes dangerous. And many times people would ask me, who are you coming from? What are you doing here? There was a animosity about who I was. Are you a cop? It was a lot of times I was asked that question. And it was a situation where anything could have gone wrong. Now, it happened to be that I had relationships with a lot of people based upon where I worked during the time period, so I knew a lot of the people. But there were times it got a little hairy. And it had not to do because of my interactions. It was the nature of the way that I was seen as another. If you lived and went to school in racially segregation, and most people in the United States do, you have to make sense of incongruity between the claim that everyone was equal and the living reality of segregation. If you lived in an integrated neighborhood or attended integrated school, you have to make sense of the segregation, and most of the society outside of the school, especially in segmented, consider the higher value of equality. Now, I absolutely agree that there is definitely problems in the school system and the way that the education is segregated. And I think that the KIPP school has done a wonderful job of going into Harlem and taking one of the worst academically run areas and showing what they could do. and they've done an amazing job. I think 90% of those kids go to college, that go to that school. And why is that? Because they start and they provide the services from a very early part to help the people that are going through the difficult part, and they basically don't believe in any child left behind. It is also highly likely that there are still racial separations within the school. And for those who have grown up in more integrated environments due to social class and changing neighborhood demographics, it is unlikely that integration has been sustained in our current lives. Reflection on these questions provide an entry point into the deeper messages that we all absorb and that shape our behavior and responses below the conscious level. In the U.S., race is encoded in geography. I can name every neighborhood in my city and its racial makeup. I can tell you if a neighborhood is coming up or down in terms of home equity, and it'll be based primarily on how its racial demographics are changing. Because people who have racial demographics changing normally change something else, which is the reason why it changes. You see, when you have areas of specific individuals where crime is more prevalent, it comes with it. It's not the racial makeup. If you go to Beverly Hills and you see African American families move into Beverly Hills, it doesn't bring down the home value. The home values don't go down because African Americans are living there. If you live among NBA players or millionaires or high executives, it doesn't bring down the neighborhood. The problem is when people when a neighborhood starts to lower the prices of homes, and people who bring in the lower the crime rate increases, and then that hurts the neighborhood. If you stop the crime rate, if you have the ability to stop the crime rate, then this would balance out much faster. But that's the factor. It's not the color of the skin that does it. It is the situation of that the neighborhood is perceived to be less safe. In the neighborhood that I live in right now, it is a very mixed neighborhood. And in the last 90 days, there's been 90 gunshots in the last 90 nights. Okay? So just to give you an idea of what living in a diverse neighborhood sometimes can lead to. When I see a child, posters on my school walls, television shows like Sesame Street told me explicitly that all people are equal, but we simply don't live together across race. It makes no sense that separation if we're equal. Why do we live separately? It must be normal and natural to live apart. Certainly no adult in my life would be complaining about separation. At a deeper level, it would be righteous that we live apart since we are better people. How did I get the message that we were better people? By the way, French people live together. Chinese people, like Chinatown, Vietnam, the Vietnamese live together. There is a tendency, Jews have a tendency of living together. There is a tendency of people to prefer in groups. There's no question about that. But that doesn't necessitate that each of those in-groups and the way they live with each other means that they're all white supremacists. Consider how we talk about white neighborhoods. Good, safe, sheltered, clean, desirable. No, there are white neighborhoods where it's poor, crime-ridden, drug-infested that are incredibly dangerous. This is an abject statement of factual poppycock. You see, when you take rich white neighborhoods and you take poor white neighborhoods, it's not talking about the same white neighborhood. And again, she does not go that bad at all. She just says that, oh yeah, those drug-infested white neighborhoods where there are high crime rates, yeah, those are safe, that people love to walk through. Because they're white people, you don't have to worry about them. It's ridiculous. By definition, other spaces, non-white, are bad, dangerous, crime-ridden, and to be avoided. No, it's based upon economics, not based upon color. These neighborhoods are not positioned as sheltered and innocent. In this way, the white racial frame is under construction. I don't believe anybody goes to an NBA game saying, oh my God, I'm afraid of the guys on the court, they're going to attack me. I don't believe that's the case. In fact, when they sit outside waiting for their autographs, I don't think the people out there are afraid of them. They're looking to meet them. They're looking to talk to them. So this nature of saying that everything comes down to race is a certain way is just factually untrue. Predominantly white neighborhoods are not outside of race. They are teeming with race. Every moment we spend in the environment reinforces powerful aspects of the white racial frame, including limited worldview or reliance on deeply problematic depictions of people of color, comfort and segregation with no sense that there might be value in knowing people of color, and internalizing superiority. In turn, our capacity to engage constructively across racial lines becomes profoundly limited. To illustrate an early lesson in white racial framing, imagine that a white mother and a white child in a grocery store. The child sees a black man and shouts, "Mommy, the man his skin is black." Several people, including the man, turn to look. How do you imagine the mother would respond? Most people would immediately put their finger on the mouth and say, "Shh." When white people are asked about what their mother might be feeling, they must agree that she's likely to feel anxious, tension, and embarrassment. Indeed, many of us have had a similar experience where the message was clear. We should not talk openly about race. What do you think when people do when see this about Muslims or Jews? Do you think that people go, "Oh, look, Ma, a Jew"? Do you think that the mother goes, "Oh, yeah, let's go talk about that"? Or the mother goes the same way? Because the nature is that we don't like to point out difference. Now, maybe it's better that we did. I don't know whether or not that's a better etiquette. But the nature of why they're doing that is not because they're embarrassed by the person's black skin. It's the embarrassment is not to point out to the person that somehow you're different. Because that we don't want to point out differences because we don't make a situation of that. I don't know if you noticed this, but my nose is not that of the smallest of the ilk. And there's been times where a little child will say about to me that, "Wow, Mom, that guy got a big nose." To which the mother will look at me mortified and apologize and say shh to the daughter. And the idea of that was not because of nose supremacy. When I use this example with my students, sometimes a student will say that their mother is just teaching a child to be polite. Wow, what a bright student. In other words, naming this maid's race would be impolite, but why? The same way naming my big nose would be impolite, or the fact that I'm bald would be impolite, or the fact that somebody has dirt in their teeth could be impolite. There's a lot of things that could be impolite by pointing out difference. What is shameful about being black? And it's nothing to do with shameful. So shameful that they should pretend that we don't notice. The mother's reaction would probably be the same if the man had a visible disability of some kind, or if he was obese. Yes, if the man was fat, you would do the same exact thing. And it's not because the person should be ashamed of being fat. If the little boy said, "Mom, that girl's very skinny," the mother might say, "Shh," because the truth is we don't like that either. But if the child seen a white person and shouted, "Mommy, that man has white skin," it's unlikely the mother would feel the same anxiety or tension and embarrassment that would come in the first statement. Oh, by the way, she would if the person had black skin and the child did that. Now imagine if the child had shouted out how handsome the man was or how strong. These statements would probably be met with chuckles and smiles. The child would not likely be shushed because we consider these statements compliments. And again, context matters. If you do walk over, and by the way, you have to be careful because if you say these compliments to some woman in your office, you could have a suit for sexual harassment where it would not be looked at as a compliment. But the nature of that is because they don't like to be put out as something different. The example of child publicly calling out black man's race and embarrassing the mother illustrates several aspects of white children's racial socializations. First, children learn there's a taboo to openly talk about race. Second, they learn that people should pretend not to notice undesirable aspects that define some people as less valuable than others. Like I said, there's many aspects of that, and some is undesirable, some is just a matter of difference. These lessons manifest themselves later in life when the white adults drop their voices before naming the race of someone who isn't white, and especially if the race being named is black. No, I don't normally drop my voice if to say somebody's black as descriptive, and it doesn't at all do that. And I don't notice that too many people do that. It's more when somebody is putting a, shall we say, racist attitude that they do that. So if somebody would go, "Wow, what do you call the principal? Yes, I met him. What do you call him? And he was a very nice guy. By the way, he just, it came up for whatever reason that he was black." Then there was a statement that he was black. But not to go out of the say, "Oh, by the way, he's black." That you wouldn't do. If we add all the comments we would make the people of color privately, when we were less careful, we may begin to recognize how white children are taught to navigate race. Now again, this ends chapter 2, thank God, of White Fragility. And again, I want to end on something that's really important again. And it's so sad that I have to do this because this entire concept that she talks about here, this white racial frame and the white people, the only way to be successful is for white people to let you in, and you can't be successful unless you're white. And I'm going to debunk this with one simple fact. This is from Harvard Office of the Vice Provost Advanced in Learning, Cybersecurity. The most successful ethnic group in the U.S. may surprise you. At and I'm not going to pronounce this name, family get-together, you can throw a stone without hitting someone with a master's degree. Doctor, lawyer, engineer, professor. Every family member is highly educated and professionally successful, and many have a lucrative side gig to boot. Parents and grandparents share stories of the kids who just won an academic honor, achievement, an athletic title, or performance in school play. Aunts and uncles and cousins celebrate one another's job promotions or the new profit one of them just started. To the Ohio-based, again I'm not saying this name, this level of achievement is normal. They're Nigerian Americans. Nigerians, by the way, are from Africa. It's just what they do. Today, 61% of the Nigerian Americans over the age of 25 hold a graduate degree, compared to 32% for the U.S.-born population. 61 to 32, which Nigerians double whites in the country. According to the Migration Policy Institute, among Nigerian American professionals, 45% work in education services. In 2016, American Community Survey found that many of the professors at top university, Nigerians are entering the medical field in the U.S. at increasing rates, leaving the home country to work in the United American hospitals, where they can earn more and work in better facilities. A growing number of Nigerian Americans are becoming entrepreneurs and CEOs, building tech companies in the U.S. to help people back home. Wait a minute, I'm confused. How are all these black people being allowed in this white supremacist culture to be able to do all this? I don't understand. This white supremacy culture is not doing its job in stopping these Nigerians. It hasn't been easy. The racist stereotypes are far from gone. In 2017, President Trump reportedly said in an Oval Office discussions, Nigerian would never go back to their huts once they saw America. But overt racism hasn't stopped Nigerians Americans from creating jobs, treating patients, teaching students, and contributing to local communities in their home, all while confidently emerging as one of the country's most successful immigrant communities, with a median household income of $62,251 compared to $57,617 nationally as of 2015. In other words, Nigerians are doing better than the white Americans in this country. I think Nigerian Americans offer unique, flashy style and flavor that people like. Wow. Who goes by his rap name Mekadon. He points to Nigerian cousins like Jollof Rice that's gaining popularity in the U.S., but more importantly, Mecca says Nigerians bring a connectivity and understanding of Africa to the U.S. Many Americans get their understanding of the motherland through our experiences and stories, he added. Nigerian-American journey is still relatively new compared to what other major immigrant communities that grew in the U.S. in the 20th century. The Nigerian-American population stood at 367,200 in 2015, according to the Rockefeller Foundation. That's roughly the strength of the Indian-American community back in 1980, before it emerged as a leading light in fields ranging from economic to technology. But Nigerian Americans are already beginning to make a dent in the national consciousness. In the case of forensic pathology, Dr. Bennett Omolu, he's helping fix his hits to the brain. The 49-year-old Omolu, again I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, was the first to discover and publish on chronic traumatic encephalopathy in American football players. Will Smith played him in the 2015 film Concussion. Imi, a Umana, the first black woman elected president of the Harvard Law Review last year, is Nigerian American. In the 2016, Nigerian-born Paulina Igabokwa became president of the United Television, making her the first woman of African descent to head a major U.S. TV studio. And the community has expanded rapidly from just 225,000 people in 1980. Traditional education has been at the heart of the community's success. But success isn't so easily defined within the culture anymore. Nigerian Americans are beginning to make a mark in sports, entertainment, the culinary arts too. Like Nigerian chef Tunidi Waya in New Orleans, who recently made headlines for using food to highly racially wealthy inequality in America. It was education that brought the early wave of Nigerians to the U.S. in the 1970s after the war against Biafra separatists in the 60s. The Nigerian government sponsored scholarships for students to pursue higher education abroad. English-speaking Nigerian students excelled at universities in the U.S. and UK, often finding opportunities to continue their education or begin their professional careers in their host country. The emphasis on education has since filtered through to their children's generation. Dr. Jacqueline Nawada, again I'm going to screw up the name, was born in Columbus, Ohio. to such Nigerian immigrant parents. Her mother is a retired engineer, now a professor at Walden University. Her father is a retired professor, now a strategist at the consulting firm focused on governance in Africa. Education was always a major priority for my parents because it was the ticket out of Nigeria. Oluwaya says her parents used their network of academics to get Oluwaya thinking about a career in medicine from a young age. By 11, she was going to summits for minorities interested in healthcare. Oluwaya was constantly busy as a kid, doing homework and sports and participating in National Honor Society and biomedical research programs. But it was the norm, she says. Her Nigerian roots meant it was expected of her. Today, Oluwaya is a family physician in the Chief Clinical Transformations Office of Rubicon MD, a leading health tech company, associate clinical professor at the University of California, San Francisco, instructor in family medicine at Columbia University, and the author of her new book, Papaya Head, detailing her experience as a first-generation Nigerian American, was published in 2008. Oluwaya's siblings are equally successful. Her older brother, Oki, again last name, is also a physician. Her younger brother, Mekadon, is a lawyer turned rapper, and her sister, Sylvia, is a managing partner of her own New Jersey law firm. But Oluwaya feels they need to do more. She doesn't want America to gain to be Nigeria's permanent loss. And they go on to explain a lot more about this. All I'm saying is, as you see, the nature of this narrative is a lie. The fact is that you could have African people in this country now, today, with this supposed white supremacy, inability to learn, inability for the access, inability to get anywhere, holding you back, is just factually untrue if you take a look at facts. Now, is it true that certain groups are being left behind? Absolutely. Do we need to take a look at that? Absolutely. But to say it's based upon the system is factually untrue, because if that was the case, Asians in this country would not be able to be better, and then Nigerians as well. So something else is going on, because when the facts don't fit your narrative, then your narrative has to be false. I hope that you like this video. I hope that you'll share it. I hope that you stuck around this long to hear all of this. And again, if you like, you become a patron to this by hitting the Subcribe-star link below. And of course, I welcome any comments. And if you disagree with anything I said, please tell me. I wish you a good night and good mental health.